Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Elmore. My guest today is Jason Shiers. Jason is a psychotherapist and certified transformative coach who's been working with addictions and mental health for over 25 years. He has a personal story of addiction and mental health struggles spanning 4 decades, both as a consumer of mental health services and also as a professional. Jason's really open to sharing his personal experiences. So today we're going to hear more about his struggles and how they ultimately led to him developing an innovative approach to treating addiction and mental health issues called the Infinite Recovery Program. Peter, I'm going to read that last sentence one more time. Jason is really open to sharing his personal experiences. So today we'll hear more about his struggles and how they ultimately led to him developing an innovative approach to treating addiction and mental health issues called the Infinite Recovery Program. Jason, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today.
Hi, thanks. I'm looking forward to see where the conversation goes.
Yes, me too.
Yeah.
Well, as we begin, do you want to share a bit more about your story and what inspired you to work in mental health and addiction recovery?
Yeah. I think like many people who work in the field, either they've been related to somebody who suffered or they've suffered themselves, and my story was um from a very early age. I had a traumatic experience as a child. I lost my dad. He was killed in an accident, and straight away, I think that my food became my coping mechanism, my friend, my loyal companion, in life. And my weight ballooned as a result. I guess I lost one parent physically and I lost the other parent emotionally, which is a very traumatic experience for a child, um, trying to make sense of the world. I guess if people ask me to say what was my childhood like in one sentence, it would be work it out for yourself. That's what it would have been. So without that present parent or that reflection or that ability to sort of understand grief or to be with emotional experience or whatever happened in that time, it's kind of like it becomes like a traumatic event that as a child you find your own way to cope with. So for me, food was the innocent, I say innocent, I always say innocent because, it was completely innocent as a child, not knowing any different, just finding a way to be okay. That's all it was. And my mum, bless her, was probably, by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I was probably, she was already at her wit's end with trying to cope with me, like to deal with me, to know what to do with me. So she just contacted the local psychiatric, it was like a clinic, at the time, and took me there because that's what she was trying to get help for me,
Right.
trying to do her best. And I was put on antidepressants. I think I was 9 or 10 years old, which I didn't
Wow.
actually know until later when I started doing psychotherapy training and I went back and got my medical reports, from my childhood and started to look at all these psychiatric reports that were created. So yeah, I was given my first diagnosis 9 or 10 years old, put on medication. Um, and then from there, things went pretty much downhill. Like started to get brought home by the police, get into crime and stealing things, stealing from home, going out with, peer pressure, going out with guys, stealing things. This was a very young age. And then I found drugs really, really young. Um, School, I mean, there's so much to my story, but like, I try and keep it as brief as possible. But like, school was crazy. I was very intelligent. I think I always try and make the distinction between helping people understand that, you can be really intelligent and have no clue about your emotional experience. I got a full bursary and scholarship for the local private school, which was prestigious and expensive. It's like, but my intelligence was so high that they gave me a full bursary, but my behavior was so chaotic that I got kicked out 3 years later. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and from there, I just got into drugs. Drugs was, I didn't even drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes at the time, but actually heroin was the first drug that I took as a young teenager, simply because I met people who had it at the time. And as soon as I took drugs, it was like, at that point, I probably had about 8 years of what I call torture, in my own mind. Just being me was torture. There was a terrible sense of dis-ease inside of me,
Mm-hmm.
what you might call the committee, was waiting for me on a daily basis when I woke up. My self-worth, my beliefs about myself, my beliefs about life, my beliefs about others, were painful. And when I found drugs, because drugs are only ever the solution, they're never the problem. So drugs were absolutely worked perfectly for what they're meant to do.
Yeah.
They made my mind go quiet. They helped me find an internal sense of ease. They stopped the obsession of the mind and the compulsion of the body that was constantly going on to find something, to do something, to escape from myself, to eat more food, to commit more crime. They stopped all that. They were the solution to everything. So that was the first time I ever took drugs. And I kind of had this, I can remember that vividly, that experience going, oh my God, this is it. I found the answer to life. It's kind of like, I can't understand why I've never knew about this before. I never want to not do this. This is the feeling that I want. I want to feel at peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just at 13 years old. I was already kind of, a friend at the time said to me, look at you, you're addicted already. The first time I ever took drugs. And he wasn't wrong. It's kind of like, I just felt like I'd landed,
Mm-hmm.
And, from then on, it was 10 years of complete chaos, prisons, institutions, psychiatric wards, like attempts at manipulating the medical system for prescription medication, committing crime, being involved in organized crime to get money to feed an addiction, and constantly going to jail. And coming out of jail, not understanding or knowing what was going on, but just thinking to myself, I'll just have one, I'll just have one this time, and then I'll get back to this normal life that I had made up in my mind while I was in jail. Excuse me. And not knowing that it was the first one, that I took that set me off on the cycle again. So as soon as I take one, I'd be nonstop. I wasn't able to stop again. And then carried on until my early 20s when I went into rehabilitation for the first time. And I only chose the rehabilitation center that I went into because it was nearby. And I had the illusion in my mind, I didn't even know what 12 steps was, but I had the illusion in my mind that I needed a break because I'd been on the streets. I lived in a homeless shelter at the time. I'd been in jail, many times. And it's like, and I needed a break, like a real break. And it was kind of like, and I kind of thought if I went to rehab, someone would feed me sleeping tablets and give me a PlayStation. It's kind of like, and that
babysitting, yeah.
That'd be what it was. It's kind of like, and that sounded really appealing compared to the life that I had. So I went to rehab and I had a huge shock because it was like therapeutic, like getting up early, groups, no phones, no communication, no books,
fun.
no magazines, no fun, nothing. Don't even smile. It's kind of like whatever you do, just do all this painful digging into your past.
Which you'd been trying to avoid for so long.
Yeah. And food and drugs really were the solution, because as soon as you took the solution away, I had this huge emptiness inside of me, a huge void. It's like that I tried to fill with everything, and food became straight back to the food. That was my first drug, really. And I went straight back to the food, and I was stealing food. I was eating food out of bins. I was stealing food out of the kitchen every night. I gained over 100 pounds in 8 weeks. That's how much food I sort of shoveled into myself, just trying to escape my experience, the emptiness that I felt inside. And I just escaped this grief my whole life, really. I just didn't want to face it. I couldn't face it. I didn't even know that I was escaping it, really. So my life got, like, for many years, got better on the outside, but worse on the inside. I went to 12 steps. I smiled. I said my life was great. I'm not using drugs today. I'm an addict, not knowing even what that was, just completely naive and just thinking that was what I had to do. I just fully accepted that I had this unexplainable disease that no one could explain where it came from or why I had it, but I had it, and because I'd been told I had it. And I needed to go to meetings in order to be okay. That's what I believed, and that's what I took on, and that's what I did. But I didn't really get any better. It's kind of like my life got great on the outside. I got a career, I got everything. I had a car, I had a life, I had a home. My family started kind of communicating with me again. I had some friends. It's kind of like, but nobody knew what I was secretly up to. The food, the obsession with the gym, the obsession with relationships and pornography and gambling and everything else that I could do to fill the emptiness inside of me that was just felt endless, you know?
It's like you replaced your coping with higher level coping and higher level coping, but on the inside, you still didn't have the insight or the healing that you needed.
Yeah, it was just a more socially acceptable thing, you know?
Sure.
It's kind of like, or it wasn't. I mean, people in meetings used to openly joke about eating too much cake, for example. You know, it's kind of like it'd be a common thing that people would come to meetings, 12 steps after being on the streets or in jail about, I don't know, for a guy, maybe a, 100 pounds or 120 pounds. You're in the US, so I use pounds. Yeah, like within a few months, they'd be 250 pounds. You know, it's like a common thing. All my friends were like that. Me too. You know, it's kind of like, and they used to joke about it. And they did seem okay with it, you know, gaining that weight. But I used to go home and secretly want to kill myself because I just
Mm-hmm.
hated my body. I was so obsessed with the outside, thinking that if somehow I wasn't so overweight, I would feel happy. You know, it was always about finding this place of peace of mind and happiness, but I just couldn't get there, you know, no matter what I tried. And so much so that during my years of recovery, you know, I had 7 cosmetic surgeries, you know, like over maybe a 15-year period, one in Asia, one in an Eastern European country, and the rest of them in the UK. But like, can you imagine like the desperation of being put to sleep in a third world country, you know, just hoping to wake up thin and happy? You know, it's like just because you are overweight. That's how intense my obsession with the body image and food was, you know, at
Mm-hmm.
times.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, going to meetings, smiling, saying life was great, you know, because that's what people seem to do. And somewhere along the line, I started off in my, you know, not that long after I got clean, a few years, started looking at counseling and psychotherapy. I did a counseling qualification first, and then I went into psychotherapy because, well, I'd got a therapist, and I thought to myself, you know, if I could learn this thing, whatever it is they know, you know, it's like maybe I could help myself. You know, that's why I went into it. And you know, so I did all sorts of qualifications, you know, in multiple modalities um, of psychodynamic, of cognitive, of person-centered approach, you know, of NLP as well. You know, it's like I did them all. And
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, at the end of it, I kind of thought, you know, I'm good at being present with somebody. I'm good at. I used to describe it as we could sit in the dark together, but nobody knew where the light switch was. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's how it felt. You know, if somebody came to me with a trauma, with a traumatic childhood, and that, you know, it was like, you know, my estimation was it was going to take a few years. You know, it's like that was the therapy process. You know, it's like, um, and I thought, and I sat and I thought about it one day, and I thought, you know, I know a lot of people that are therapists, you know, and it's kind of like, and I don't really know anyone who's happy. You know, it's like I don't know anyone who's truly content, who's says that they have a real peace of mind and a real internal joy for nowadays what I call joy for no good reason, happiness for no good reason. You know, I didn't know anybody who had that.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, you know, there was the in the 12th step, you know, it talks about spiritual awakening and the 12 steps, you know, and it's kind of like, and I still used to say, what is this spiritual awakening thing? What does it actually mean? You know, it's like, and no one could really answer it to a satisfactory level where it made any sense to me, you know. Um, and to be honest, I mean, there'd been some spiritual change for sure because I'd gone from committing crime, you know, to having a somewhat productive on the outside life. You know, it's but my internal world was still pretty devastating, and my
Right.
behavior was still pretty devastating. You know, um, so I just kept. I always had this sense of seeking. I always had this sense of kind of um, looking for something. So after my all my therapy stuff, I started doing other things, all the other alternative things like silent meditations. I did all of Tony Robbins' courses, coaching stuff. I became a qualified life coach. I did the Hoffman process. I did the Landmark Forum. I did anything I could where somebody told me that, oh, this might work. You know, there was
Right.
all these new therapies were coming out, EMDR, um, rapid transformation therapy, tapping, different things, you know, were all being developed, I guess, at that time. And I would try anything, you know, because I just wanted to experience some peace of mind. And, you know, in my in my seeking, people used to say around the 12 steps and around the therapy world that I was around, people used to say to me that, seeking is your problem. You need to stop seeking. They used to say to me, if you stop seeking, you'd be okay. You
But you
know,
can't say that to someone who's looking for an answer.
yeah,
It
but
doesn't work.
that's what people used to say. And I used to think, you just, like, how do you stop seeking? In fact, I say to people, never stop seeking now. That's what I say, because to me, seeking is our intuition of home. It's our intuition of knowing a better life. It's our intuition of knowing that the experience we're having, there's something missing. It's like, and,
Yeah.
and it was only that what led me, to my experience, I think. So after Tony Robbins, it was only, I call it a serendipitous moment, or life delivering to me, where something, or the universe working in my favor, that I found this video called The Path of Effortless Change. And I just thought my whole life had been, it's like carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. That's what it
Hmm.
had been like my whole life. It was like
Absolutely.
trudging through quicksand, on a daily basis, every day from the
Just a
moment I
fight
woke up.
every day. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so the name of this course just did it for me. Effortless. I thought, if
Hmm.
there's nothing in my life has been effortless, nothing has come easy, nothing has been free, nothing has been simple. So I thought this course sounds great for everyone else. It's kind of like, I'm going to share this. I'm going to get it. I'm going to share it with these people, because I was in this personal development group. But the only way I could share it was to watch it, because I couldn't find a way to download it, and I had to screen record it. And to screen record it, I had
Mm.
to have the sound on.
And
And
watch
like,
it. Yeah.
yeah, I know I didn't plan to watch it. I had it playing and recording it, but what happened was it captivated me unknowingly to myself. I wasn't sat looking for the answers at the time, and I often say this to people now, listen to my words kind of like you listen to music, and if any of them really jump out and grab you, it's kind of like, take notice of that. Don't listen intently for the answers to your problems, but really allow the words to wash over you like you would, if you're listening to a concert or something.
Hmm.
And that's what I did. I just kind of sat there, and these words were coming, and I kept finding myself going, wow, what's this guy talking about? I want to know more. There's something inside of me that feels resonance with what I'm hearing, and I listened to it, and I was kind of, at the end of it, I kind of thought that was, there was something really interesting about that, but I couldn't, my intellect hadn't caught up, I couldn't go, oh, I know this guy was saying what I need to do is do this, this, and this, then I'll be, it was nothing like that. It was just like a feeling of resonance, of connection with some of the words that had been shared, and a deeper knowing that I had to know more about it. And my friend bought me a book of this guy's, and I read it, and I kind of thought, don't know, it was nothing much, and then it was a year later when I was going to LA to a coaching training, something completely different. I'd remembered that this guy lived in LA, and I looked him up, and he had a, what he called a small group intensive, happening 2 days after I was in LA, and I thought, I've got to change my flights, and it's like, and I booked a place on this course, and I went there, and I spent 2 days only, and it was funny because, I showed up there after years and years and years of credentials, thinking that I knew a thing or two, but I was still angry, and I was still empty,
Hmm.
inside. And I remember him saying, at the start of it, I was kind of sat there revved up, waiting for the answer to all my problems,
Right.
and he said, can you just be here and just listen, like, not try and compare this to something, not see if it's the right or wrong, not listen in a way that you want to write down, remember everything, because if you hear anything important, you'll remember it anyway. It's the first time anyone had ever invited me to be present, like
Mm-hmm.
in every other training I'd been to, what happens was the person starts speaking, every person in the class pulls out their notebook and starts scribbling down everything that everyone's saying, so I used to do that too, because that's what I thought you did, in trainings. And so I sat for 2 days, and I just kind of had nothing on my mind, and I just felt very present and listened, and I remember at the end of those 2 days, I sat in this Airbnb, and it was in Los Angeles, and there was this beautiful green kind of valley at the back. It was on a Friday afternoon, the sun was going down, and there was this rope swing, and I was just sat there feeling this beautiful sense of peace inside. And I thought, I can still feel the connection with that moment, and I just think that I just kind of, again, my intellect had not caught up, because I was going, well, I haven't got more money, not got a new relationship, haven't lost weight. It's like, haven't got more clients in my business, can't really work out why I'm feeling so good. It's like, but
Yeah.
I just knew, it's like I just woken up out of a bad dream. And I just had this beautiful feeling of bliss. It was just stayed with me for hours and hours. And I just sat there out listening to the birds. And I thought, I don't remember if I've ever heard the birds like that before. I don't know if I've ever
Mm-hmm.
seen nature like that in that way before, and it's kind of, and I just felt so peaceful, and it took a while for me. But I tell you what I knew. I knew that few days before I traveled back to England, um, I contacted my therapist, and I was very fussy because I was a therapist about finding a therapist. I'd had the same therapist for 7 years, and I contacted her to say the next session will be the last one. I don't need it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew there's something inside of me that absolutely knew that all my seeking was for myself, that I'd had a realization of who I was, and that I was no longer the addict, or the broken long list of diagnoses, or the traumatized child anymore. I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the survivor either. It's like all those things had happened, but like I'd become caught up in them along the way, and ironed them onto myself as part of my identity. Um, I also knew, I mean, so many things came to me in those couple of days. I thought, shit, I can't really do psychotherapy in the same way anymore, because I don't really see the value of what I was doing before. I knew my life was going to change. I didn't go back to 12-step meetings either. I mean, I'd been in 12 steps for 22 years, at that
Mm-hmm.
point, and I'm 29 years clean now. So it's like, it took a while for my brain to catch up with what had happened, and I just basically, as I describe it now, I had seen what I call true nature. I'd had an experience of what I call the perfect place of mental health inside of me. It's like I'd seen through the thought story that I lived in on a daily basis. It had like fallen apart somewhere in those 2 days. It had like, I realized that on a daily basis, I made up this story about myself, who I thought I was, what had happened to me, what I was a victim of, what I was a survivor of, all the labels that had been given to me by the mental health profession, over time, innocently. I don't take any of it as malicious. I know no one had bad intentions, but I realized that all those things were not true. They were not who I was. They'd been a momentary a period of time in my experience, of where I'd been at, but they were not who I was, and who I was beyond all those things. And it was like it's what I call a spiritual awakening. It was a real
Mm-hmm.
seeing of a deeper truth.
Yeah, I
Um,
love that you're using that phrase, because what I've been thinking is, well, a few things, but one thing is, I heard someone say one time, and I feel like it's really true, that people who struggle with addiction actually see the world in a deeper way, and they have more insight perhaps than people who don't necessarily struggle with mental health or an addiction. And it's the idea that there's this existential angst that some people have. And I just kept thinking of that phrase when you were describing your story is, you had all this knowledge and insight, but really your deep wound from trauma and really rough experience most of your life was existential, right? This question of like the questions you were asking, and the seeking of who am I and what is this purpose? And so it seems like your search for peace was really an existential search, not a knowledge search. And I don't know if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis. He's one of my favorite authors, but he has a quote that says, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. So he uses that to explain this desire for heaven, and like why death is so upsetting to us if we're not made for another world. And it seems to me like you were just having this existential struggle your whole life. And we know in order to feel peace and change, the research shows we need two things. One is knowledge, but one is an experience, a new experience. And it's like you had all this knowledge and all this training. You literally looked for every knowledge that was on the face of the earth, it seems like, and trained for all of this information, but that wasn't enough. You needed a new experience. And that's what you found in the retreat, the spiritual awakening, as you call it.
Yeah. I think that's it makes sense, and I guess what I've seen, since then is that, like everyone is in search of themselves, it's kind of like in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of innocent ways, in however their beliefs have been colored, in their experience, whatever their conditioning is, whatever their societal, cultural, family conditioning was, whatever their traumatic or adverse events in childhood, how their makeup was, in their early lives and the decisions that they made, colors their so-called, potential in the human realm. It's kind of like, but there's a deeper paradigm. There's a spiritual, a spiritual beings having a human experience. And there's part of us that is perfectly healthy at all times. It's what I call innate health. It's like there's a part of us that's not damaged, that's never can be damaged, by our experience. And I guess one of the things that I learned in that weekend was that life is an inside out experience. It's not an outside in experience. For many people lost in the psychological professions and, innocently, again, just following what they've been taught from a knowledge perspective, not from a deeper paradigm perspective, but like, and like you said, people that have suffered, it's like I say addiction is the lost man's way to enlightenment, because it really is kind of always pointing us home back inwardly, because after we've tried everything else, there's nothing else to do. But the last choice is kind of like, okay, I have to look. Introspection is the answer, not getting my ducks in a row, so to speak, in the outside world.
Right. That
So
comes second to feeling inner peace and calmness. Yeah.
yeah, and that's kind of what I'd seen in that weekend was inside out meant that life was happening inside of me. My creation of myself was inside of me. My projection, everything happened in my mind, and I projected it onto the world. Not I saw what happened in the world and became a victim of that. And in fact, while there is a material paradigm outside of us, objects, people, places, and things, it's like everything happens inside, as Viktor Frankl said, in between, I can't remember, I'll probably butcher the thing, but in between stimulus and experience, there's perception, it's kind of
Yeah.
like, that's what he said. And it's like, that's kind of what I saw, is that everything is happening inside of me. It's my own perception. It's my own creation, and what I believe is what happens. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy that happens. What I believe about myself. I'm an addict. I'm a victim. I've got a terrible life. Nothing ever works out for me. And then I just create that in the world. And then I go, see, I told you so. That's exactly what I said my life was. So I'd really seen that everything, not most things or not some things, but everything was happening inside of me, my whole experience.
The
And
perception is what really matters more so than what happens to people. Yeah.
yeah,
So, how did you take that experience, that I guess we'll call it the weekend retreat, where you finally found peace and comfort and stillness for the first time, and apply that to yourself moving forward? But then also, how did you use that to help other people?
I kind of knew my therapy practice would change, at that point. And I didn't really know what implications that would have on my own life, at the
Right.
time. But like everything changed. It's like, like I said, I stopped going to 12 steps. My eating disorder of 40 years disappeared. It's never
Wow.
come back. It's like I didn't have to do anything. It just happened. I just knew. I just felt a deep sense of joy and peace with my life. Um, I did some trainings with the same guy, in America that I had that first experience with. And I was mentored by a couple of people in the US for a few years. I really wanted to get my head around how I could share what I'd experienced with other people in an effective way. How I could help to point people to the truth. I mean, I guess the way I see it today is, I just became one of the many fingers pointing to the same moon. To the and like there are lots of spiritual traditions east and there's lots of western in the east, and there's lots of western treatments that incorporate eastern traditional stuff. It's kind of like that are, I say today my work's psycho spiritual. It's the
Mhm.
psychological coupled with the eastern and spiritual stuff.
Mhm.
um, so I kind of spent those few years really being in that beautiful experience. I mean, it was an amazing, and a lot of it was undoing, and a lot of what I do today is undoing what people believe about themselves, undoing what's been installed into people, undoing what people think they need to do to change. There's all sorts of beliefs that people have bought into innocently over time for the experiences that they've had, especially in the systems. If they've been through the system, have been through rehab, they've been through therapy and stuff, they believe change is hard, that it's difficult, that they've got a long list of things that's wrong with them, and that the possibility of peace is long way away and takes hard work and stuff. When no, it can happen. It can happen in a second. An insight can happen in a second, and change comes from the inside out. I call it an unfolding, because it's already seeing something that's already there. It's not teaching somebody something new in order for them to have a better experience. It's not like a technique or something that they have to do to get better. It's just like by relaxing the cognitive function of their own mind, they get to see the deeper truth that's already there within them. So I spent those few years really kind of looking at, doing those trainings and looking at how I would share this stuff with others. And then just in my work, I just continued my work, and my work with others has really helped me see how effective, it was to point people to their innate health versus treating them as having something wrong with them and trying to fix it. I saw the massive impact that it had on people in a short period of time. Whereas, like I said before, people that had come to my practice before, let's say they'd been abused, raped, or had a violent childhood, or had drug addicted parents, it would be years of therapy. It's kind of like, and I started to see people have a dramatic change in the space of a few hours of sessions. It's kind of like they started to, and I was always the first port of call where people would say, "You're the first person that said that I'm okay, that I'm not
Aw,
broken."
yeah. That is one of the big faults that people talk about a lot with the psychology system or mental health system in general, is it's really problem focused, which is understandable. Like, we want to help people get better, but the language and the focus is very negative. And so I've heard that recently over the years, that people are trying to come up with a different approach that's more positive and more empowering. And so it sounds like you've definitely uncovered an avenue to do that. Can you give an example of what that might look like in session? Because I mean, I love the example you shared for yourself at the retreat, but I'm wondering, how do you take that same idea and guide people to an experience like that in session with you?
Yeah. I call them transformative conversations, because they're really guided by a deeper wisdom than my own intellect, and I just show up to sessions and be in the moment with people, and it can always, and it's not a linear process to awakening, but it's like, it always happens. And it's kind of like pretty much always anyway. And there's no guarantees, but like, even today, I give an example of a client that I work with for a few months today, and it's like she, with compulsive eating, and the conversation we had today, and I don't ask about the compulsive eating because that's not the problem. That was like for me, it was only ever the solution. I know that that's the solution to a deeper misunderstanding that happens inside for people, and it's quite, for some people, that's quite strange. We're not going to talk about your eating, we're not going to talk about your gambling or your pornography addiction, or whatever it is,
Well,
it's
it's like
like,
what you mentioned earlier, like it's just a way to cope. And you're really interested in what's at the root of this. Why is this person needing to cope?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly that, so it's like, so along the way, I didn't ask, and today was, near the end of the sessions, and I said, "How's that?" And like she said, "Oh, it's amazing. I don't know what happened," and it's kind of like, and we both laughed about how it came about. It's kind of like that somewhere in the process, she just had found inside of her just a decision to change, and it had become simple, whereas she'd been trying to do that for years. Excuse me, and not been able to. And that was my experience too, that I could make decisions to change my behavior, but it never lasted because my internal dis-ease was so intense that I always needed the food to cope, even though it was an unconscious process. I couldn't connect "I'm unhappy" with "I need to eat." It just came as an urge. And like what I've seen with people, I'm jumping about a bit here, but what I've seen with people is that the nicer experience they have of being alive, the less they need to medicate themselves, and I mean, I've never seen anybody wake up one day and go, I'm really happy today. My life feels great. I'm happy for no good reason. I think I'll take crack cocaine today. It's kind of like nobody does that. It's
Right.
like I know if someone comes to me and says, I'm struggling with food, pornography, sex, money, drugs, alcohol. I know. My first question is, how's the relationships in your life? Because it's
Mhm.
always that. It's always
It's always
showing up in that
coping.
too. Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's
always
always a
kind of,
way to cope. I'm
yeah.
still having a hard time picturing this conversation between you and your client. Is it, and maybe it's hard to quantify because I know the whole point of it is an experience, nothing informed by like the prefrontal cortex conversation. But is there
Yeah.
any way you can kind of paint the scene a little bit more for us and our listeners of are you using specific questions to help guide this client into a sense of calmness, or is it you're just emoting with her? What's the strategy that you use to help people?
Well, for one, we're unpicking beliefs. It's kind of like when I say,
Deconstructing.
yeah, when we're undoing, I call it undoing rather than doing, seeing what's right with you rather than what's wrong with you. It's like with addiction, one thing that I help people see is that it's an innocent coping mechanism of the mind body system. It's kind of like, whereas everyone else has pathologized it as a problem, it's kind of like in mine, what I'm helping people see is that if we live in a self-correcting mind-body system, like you cut your finger, it heals itself, you break your leg, it fixes itself, you put food in your mouth, digests itself, you don't have to do anything. It's like, so why would the mind be different? Why is the standard state of the body health and the standard state of the mind is not? It's kind of like, if you start to think about all these things, then think of addiction as like the steam valve on a pressure cooker. It's kind of like, of course, if you make your mind busy with an innocent misunderstanding, then if you don't have a steam valve on the pressure cooker, it's going to explode. So perhaps psychosis or suicide are the next option. So it seems like addiction is everything working exactly as it's meant to. So I help people see that there's pointing in that way, like helping people see that everything they're doing is an innocent misunderstanding. There's nothing wrong with them, and to see what's right. An undoing of beliefs. People often hold a lot of beliefs about themselves, and often there's a repressed emotion. It's kind of like, so
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of looking at any experiences where trauma shows up. Perhaps there's not a thought-based experience. There's something that just happens, a contraction of the body, in the moment, and it's kind of like really look. Sometimes with my work, I'm particularly looking at the somatic experience. What's the body telling us? A lot of beliefs are held in the body with people that have had adverse childhood experiences and traumatic events. So sometimes it'll be that non-verbal kind of communication with the body, and that could be an inquiry into the body, like looking at a particular experience. Somebody would bring something like I don't know, I met somebody today, and this is the experience I had, and I reacted to them. So we kind of
Yes.
re-trigger that event and kind of look at what is the body telling us. Often there's a repressed emotion from childhood, or there's an internal belief that got created, a deficiency story. I'm not good enough, I'm never lovable, I'll never make it, something like that, that's been created as a response, as a safety response to adverse events in childhood, that's then been innocently carried, into adult life, and as a repressed emotion, or just an internal belief that's been embodied, and then is responding to the moment. Like people are using their food or whatever process they're using to escape from that, yet they can't see it even. It's just happening completely unconsciously. So a lot of it's undoing and deconstructing. Undoing beliefs, particularly the beliefs that have been installed by people that they've been to see before and things like that, and helping them see what's right with them, and then processing any repressed or sort of embodied stuff that's happened from childhood trauma. Not everyone's had a traumatic childhood, but most people, if
Most.
they really look at it, they have.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was helpful. Thank you. I feel like I can picture what you do more now. And it really sounds to me, if I may try and summarize, you can correct me if I'm missing anything, but it really sounds to me like you're using the best of everything you learned, but incorporating it with what was actually helpful for you and actually transformative for you. And it seems like what you just spoke about at least has about three main components. One is the approaching it from a positive model as opposed to a deficient model, where you're really helping people have a new perspective of themselves and anchoring in on their strengths and their values as opposed to the quote unquote problem or symptoms, as we might say. And then secondly, the deconstructing, which sounds similar to CBT, but I know you're not doing specifically CBT, but really just undoing negative thoughts and undoing negative beliefs and reworking situations and values to be more conducive for them. And then thirdly, you're really giving people a transformative experience, which again, we know is really powerful for change and maintaining change. Like you were speaking about, once you had your experience, you didn't really have to do anything, but your eating disorder fell away, right?
Yeah.
And so you're really providing an environment for people to have either a somatic change or an emotional change or just some kind of restorative experience, which is really powerful.
Yeah, and I mean, like it's not wrong what you said. I think like the way, I mean, I haven't finished my book yet, but the way I put it together in my book is, the first place is I want people to see not their story, so to see the role of thought in their reality, to see the reality that they've created for themselves, and to see that life is an inside out experience, not an outside in experience. So they start to see the role that they play in their own suffering, in the creation, and the exacerbation that they do, how they perpetuate their own symptoms and struggles and beliefs and stuff like that. Once they've kind of seen that to the point where it's a palpable and noticeable experience, kind of like they're not looking outwardly anymore. They're not coming to me saying, my girlfriend said this and this happened and I didn't get paid and my job hates me. We're not even having that conversation anymore.
We call those crises of the week in therapy,
yeah, we're
right?
not doing
They're not
that.
having those anymore. Yeah.
Very quickly, we're kind of going, this happened and here's what happened to me. Here's how I responded. Here's what happened on my internal experience. So we're straight away introspection, it's like that. Once there's an awakening of the mind, a realization of beyond the story, it's then kind of looking at the somatic stuff, like you said, and kind of like, and along the way, beliefs will come out and there'll be undoings of different deeper seated beliefs that hadn't been seen in the first part of the process, and somewhere in that, people will stop medicating their experience in some way or another, not through effort, not through trying, not through having to or making it difficult, that it will just make sense to them that they don't need to do that anymore. And I've seen that happen almost every time, and it's like every time I laugh, with joy, it's kind of like to saying, I really didn't know how that was going to come about. I really didn't even think about it. And sometimes when people tell me, I'm kind of like thinking, wow,
right. But
I
it's
just
like you
trust that it
equipped
happens.
them with how to
Yeah.
be still and how to process and how to feel again, which is what happened with you and your journey as well. So it makes
Yeah.
sense. It makes perfect sense that you're equipping them with a different way to cope and to process so they don't need all these other things eventually, which is wonderful.
Yeah. And an embodied experience as well, I'd always say is
Yes.
best because like I think like anyone that's had a traumatic experience has dissociated so much so that they're kind of like I had, was just completely unaware of the emotional state of the body. And they're like, I used to call myself a walking to-do list, that's kind of what I was. I wasn't connected to my body, and it's like really having that embodied experience of being able to feel again, and being connected and it being safe to do so, versus just having a head level seeing of the mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. You already had all the knowledge, but you needed it to anchor into your experience. But you're right. It's when someone has a really traumatic experience or several small ones over the years, however it gets there, it's the brain doing its job to dissociate from the body, but then healing is reconnecting those and calming enough to connect them. So it sounds like that's another way to articulate what you're doing. Well, when's your book going to be done? I'm interested in it.
My own experience keeps evolving, my deeper
Yeah.
seeing of truths and stuff. And it's like I end up spending more time going back and looking at changing things, it's kind of like, but I've written most of it. I'm hoping this year it would be released, like I just, I explained it to somebody earlier. It's kind of like at the moment, it's like I don't want to take somebody on a journey, and promise them this beautiful destination and then leave them 3/4 of the way and say, here you go. It's kind of like find the rest of the way yourself. I want to be able to feel complete with it, so,
Fair enough.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we could talk about this for hours and hours, but as we're wrapping up, is there anything that you'd want to leave our listeners with who might be struggling with addiction or, maybe they're listening and feeling like this just really resonates with them? Is there any message of hope that you'd want to share?
Yeah, I mean, couple of things. One is the never stop seeking. There's part of you that really knows, that there's a place of home, that there's respite from this suffering, and it's never giving up on that and kind of staying with that knowing. I've been to way too many funerals in my time, and it always pains me to see that people couldn't find the way out, and I know that that feels like an option when things are really dark, because my life, suicide was certainly an option for me many times in those dark years, and it's like, so never give up that seeking. And just allow life to guide you. It's kind of like, that's what I did. It's kind of like I was so desperately trying to find help, and it's kind of like when I sort of just noticed that life was kind of guiding me, along the way. It's like people were always trying to help me. Like life is always giving you that, it's kind of like, but I was so caught up in my own mind that I couldn't really accept help from anyone. It's kind of like, and there'll be people wanting to help anyone who's suffering, there'll be somebody wanting to help, it's kind of like, and really just allowing whatever help comes your way, just to point you in whatever direction that is that makes sense. And just to know that there's no right way, if somebody's going to guide you, just follow that, and it's like you always end up home. That's my experience of what I've seen, and what's happened in my journey.
I like that image of home as like a central grounding place, and then whatever happens to you happens, but at least you have home in your mind and in your heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Where can we learn more about you and your work?
The addiction program is called Infinite Recovery Projects, infiniterecoveryproject.com. More conversations, what I call transformative conversations, on my podcast, misunderstandingsofthemind.com, which is all kind of transformative conversations like this, really looking at towards our true nature, the spiritual part of us, and seeing how, we got a little bit lost in our psychological experience, and seeing what's true, like beyond that. And you can find me through any of those two places,
Okay. Well, we'll keep an eye out for your book sometime in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has been such an interesting and thoughtful discussion. And I feel like you're a really good example of a belief I have that people who suffer can gain so much resilience and so much purpose in the world. And not that it's easy to get there, but I feel like people who suffer have a unique insight and a unique ability to really help other people and get a lot out of life instead of just sort of existing without thinking too much about it. And I think you're a wonderful example of not giving up and struggling through all of that and ending up in this wonderful place where you're able to help so many people. And yeah, just appreciate your vulnerability. It probably wasn't easy to talk about all of that, or maybe you're used to it by now, but I appreciate you sharing all of your previous experience and how that played into the creation of your program to help people.
Yeah. And if it can just help one person, that's what I always say, I always do this. I always have conversations and stuff. If it can just make a difference to one person, it's like, that's valuable,
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for making the time. I know it's late where you are, so I do appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. I also want to remind our listeners that this episode, its resources, and all of our other shows can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. Visit triadhq.com/BHT today and explore our archive. And thank you, our listeners, for joining in on the conversation. We always appreciate you being here with us and look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.